going to start, and what I want to do first, I have some little comedy here too towards the end or towards the middle somewhere. But just, I think the one thing that's always funny is that people kind of figure it out right away. Most people figure me out because I talk too much. But I think Ron Penn summed it up correctly when he said this about me. He said, "Brad, you're the Presbyterian Rain Man." I think that captures it all. And what I'm going to talk about is some things about Puritanism, but I'm going to start in England. And I'm going to start in England because the sufferings that happened there and the experiences of separatists, which were more pilgrims, okay, versus non-separatists, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Baptists. There was tremendous persecution. That persecution actually started even before Henry VIII assumed the throne and was separated from the Roman Catholic Church. And the first person I'm going to kind of talk about is John Wycliffe. And John Wycliffe was often referred to as the evening star of scholasticism and the morning star of the Reformation. And Wycliffe was a brilliant theologian. He was an Oxford graduate. He wrote probably one of the very first Bibles in English. And he had some beliefs and feelings that were very much what Luther said, but mind you, Luther's 1510, Wycliffe is 1360. So he wrote a Bible, and there were three components of the conduct of the Catholic Church that he really took exception with. And one was first and foremost, and something we can identify with today, he believed strongly in the personal interpretation of the Bible. Okay. What that meant was several things. First, it meant literacy for church members. And mind you, in England at that time, which was fairly literate compared to most countries, probably 4%, if it was that. Okay. It was very low. Second was the holiness of the individual. That a priest was no better than any congregant or parishioner. That they're all equal before the eyes of God. That knocked right at the whole hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church. Now you've got people who can read the Bible. It's not in Latin anymore. Now you're telling them that they're holy. And then the last thing that he had, and I want to capture this, he attacked the wealth and luxury of the Roman Catholic Church. Sales of indulgences and simony, which simony was purchasing a priesthood, you know. And there were a lot of wealthy people that bought priesthoods and were illiterate or know nothing of the Bible. And that was always a criticism of the Reformation. The people who followed Wycliffe were called the Lollards. And Lollardy was how they were referred to. And it wasn't a very nice thing to be called, because basically Lollardy means in Middle English a mumbler, rolling of the tongues. So they basically, because people felt they spoke of nonsense. So it wasn't a very popular thing to be called a Lollard. During his lifetime, he preached in Lutterworth, England. He was not just a parish priest, he was also a don at Oxford University. He was head of one of the colleges at Oxford for many years. He was probably considered to be the foremost scholar in the area of Koine Greek and Classical Greek, because for the first time the Byzantine Empire was letting people come back to Europe to teach. And so there was very, very few people in academia that knew how to speak Greek or how to interpret it. In the aftermath of his death, he died of a stroke, I want to say around Christmas 1388. And in 1415, they found at the Council of Constance, they passed a death sentence on him. Now, he was already dead. What they actually did was, this is a great book called, the greatest book ever written, which is about Wycliffe to a degree. And they actually exhumed his remains. They took his remains and tied them to a stake, burned them, and then they took a pistol and they broke the bones into pieces and they threw it in the River Swift. And like most things that are Protestant, I'm a pre-fly fisherman. The Swift is not as bad as Trout Stream. So I fish deliberately for that reason, because every place I go that's spiritual, I'm serious, are like Trout Stream. It's amazing. I'll get to that more later. So he had the Bible in English, and as a matter of fact, it's interesting. He did the same thing that later on William Tyndale did. He first translated the New Testament He finished all that, and then he finished the Old Testament. If you look at the modern King James Bible, about 70% of the New Testament and about 60% of the Old Testament is based upon Wycliffe. And next, what I'm going to do is bring in a predecessor. Now we've got 1380, and now we're going to go to 1500. We're talking like 100 years, 110 years later. And the next person to really be a lightning rod and a leader in the formation of the Protestant religion was John Wycliffe. And John Wycliffe was, again, a very brilliant theologian. He believed in the same things that Wycliffe did, but he did it in a more modern setting. And his work was even more expensive. You see, Wycliffe translated from the Vulgate, which is the Latin version of the Catholic Bible, because there weren't many sources of the Greek or the Hebrew. Tyndale had access to most of those documents 110 years later. And so he basically didn't work from the Vulgate, from the Latin, he worked from the original texts as much as they could find them. So he worked from the Hebrew, from the Aramaic, and from the Koine Greek, and also little parts of classical Greek in the New Testament. And he wrote the entire Bible. I shouldn't say the entire Bible. He wrote the New Testament, again, based a lot on Wycliffe. And again, there's a quote from him, and I think this captures our religion to this day. And let's see if we can find it here. But what he wanted to say, basically, I'll paraphrase it. When I finish writing this Bible, a common plowboy will know more scripture than a priest. And again, he wanted to put the scripture in the hands of the people. He wanted to make two things. He wanted people to be their own ministers, to reinterpret the Bible, but also he wanted to make the hierarchy accountable. You can't make the stuff up as you go along because, well, we can sell indulgence because, well, we can. I'm the vicar of Christ, and whatever I say goes. There shouldn't be any challenge to that. And in his lifetime, he was also a professor at Cambridge University. He was a Cambridge man, which most Puritans, most of our people, non-separatists, were eventually from Cambridge. Oxford, about 1500, became very hostile to anybody who was not Church of England. So you'll find that, as a matter of fact, out of all the founding ministers who came here, what they call the Great Migration of the 1630s from England, of the Puritans, almost every single minister graduated from Emmanuel College at Cambridge, almost all of them, and they all knew each other for the most part. So again, he wrote his Bible, and actually what's interesting, in the case of Tyndale, and in the case of my family were weavers. They were from Dorchester, England. And there was a big time between Protestantism and people who produced wool and weavers. I don't know what it was, but they were tradespeople. They were not just common peasants. They were probably what we call middle class, very middle class today. And so all the Bibles that Tyndale was printing was in the Netherlands. So what happened is, in those days, the Netherlands had made a big jump on the technology of England as far as weaving was concerned. So the raw wool would leave England, go and be woven in the Netherlands and come back. And in there were hundreds and hundreds of Tyndale Bibles coming back, as much as they were completed. And so the English throne, the hierarchy, at that point still being the Roman Catholic Church, they worked aggressively trying to intercept this. Ultimately, what happened is that a person who today has great acclaim, and I don't think they deserve it, is Sir Thomas More. Sir Thomas More made it a point in his lifetime to hunt down and plan to execute William Tyndale. And he succeeded. Basically, Tyndale agreed to go meet some members of the Catholic Church to work out some differences. Thomas More had arranged for him to be captured and taken to the civil authorities. And that point it was still Spanish Netherlands, so it was still from Spain. And they had a summary trial, and he was killed by garrote and by then burning at the stake. To this day, 90% of the New Testament, word for word, is from him. 90% of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, are all from William Tyndale. So what I'm trying to tell you is, today we paint over a lot. And I remember I studied history back in the 80s, 70s. And at that time, Puritans were still funny people. They were extreme people. They were wackos. Anybody saw Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible? They're a bunch of nuts. They're like out there. They're extreme. Shakespeare refers to them always, it's a joke. The word Puritan was like just over the top. It was like being a Jehovah's Witness to me, probably. It was like, it's just out there. And they were not bad people. I think what I want to capture here, and this has been called in all scholarship the last 30 years, is that, yes, they were typical people of the 15 systematics. Today, so often we want to transfer all of our beliefs, all of our concept of this American democracy. They didn't come here for democracy. They were persecuted. It's like going to Israel today. You come because you believe in the religion and you're being persecuted. If you don't believe, don't bother coming. As many Quakers and Catholics found out when they reached Boston and were on the next ship back. As a matter of fact, even some Church of England people who started espousing Arminianism, and I'll get that in a minute, they would be packed up pretty quickly and sent back. So they weren't horrible people, but they were really strict. And they believed in the Bible pretty much literally. Of course, today we're not at that point. They pretty much did. And their whole society was a theocracy. I just want to go off to, I can continue with that. The one thing is that, let's just go back and we'll look at where did they settle? What were they coming here for? Okay. So Henry VIII becomes King of England. He wants to get a divorce and because his wife can't bear a male child. So he creates the Church of England in order to solemnize that particular act, and he becomes the head of the Church of England. Now, a lot of Puritans, which are Presbyterians, like that. And at that time in Puritans, there were Presbyterians. We had Congregationalists on one side, and they kind of captured the Baptists, and then we had Presbyterians. And they weren't just from Scotland. There were a lot of Presbyterians, especially like where my family's from in Dorset. There were a lot in that part of the country as well. And there was a difference there. Now, we had the Separatists. They were going to try to reform the Church of England, the Pilgrims being that group. But this group were not Separatists. They wanted to Puritanize. They wanted to reform the Church of England and make it pure. And what they meant was that when Henry VIII took over the church, what he did was he brought Calvinistic theology into the church, which we all have to this day. But he kept all the ecclesiastical components of the Roman Catholic Church. So you had, the Pope was now the king or queen. The next person down would be the Archbishop of Canterbury. And that was a whole hierarchy going down. The whole ceremony, even to this day, is like 85–90% pretty much a Roman Catholic ceremony for the most part. And these Puritans said, you went halfway, but you could have gone a little bit further. Henry VIII dies. He's succeeded by his son, Edward VI. He was a very good king. Lasted 5 years, and then Mary came to the throne. And she took the church from being separate to being Roman Catholic for 5 years. Now, at that time, there was a group of people called the Marian exiles. And these were all the ministers and people that were persecuted and executed during the time of Queen Mary's rule. And as a Catholic, she was ferreting out and killing hundreds of ministers, hundreds of Protestants throughout the country. So people escaped to the Netherlands. That was where most people went. Some to Ireland, but most to the Netherlands. And you'll see most of the ministers that came here with the early Puritans had been in Leiden, Amsterdam. They've been over there for a period of 10 or 12 years. So again, there was real suffering going on. And I just want to bring some of this out. Because when I was growing up, I remember the painting over Puritans on bad people, hung witches. They didn't burn any. They pressed one, and I think in total probably hung about 27, besides the same. Same time in Europe and Germany, they basically executed several thousand witches. Again, the population's bigger, but it was no different than what the experience was. It was a common practice. But again, getting back to the separatism and the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians. So they had the same theology. We come up to the point where Mary dies. Elizabeth is more permissive. People start coming back somewhat from the Netherlands, but still not totally safe. You have to do two things. And the one thing you have to do, right here, this is the little devil. This is the little devil. Our friends from Scotland will recognize the little devil. The Book of Common Prayer. I'll tell you what it does. I love it though. I do love the book. You had to preach from this. Forget about your sermon. Forget about if there was a tragedy this week. This had a calendar in it. You were going to preach every day from here. And we had a sermon for death, for marriage, for illness, for the plague, and you read from here. Well, the Puritans said, no, I don't think so. We're all scholars, we're all highly educated men. We think there's some good things here, but we don't want to be limited to this book. We would like to refer to the whole Bible. Now, the funniest thing was, I always thought that that was the biggest problem that the Puritans had, was because it limited the interpretation. And really wasn't, a lot of it is from Scripture, but it's not the Scripture. But I found out in my research they actually were more agitated because Parliament never voted in favor of it. It's democracy. And the Puritans said, we don't like it, but if Parliament had been allowed to vote on it, we would have accepted it. We would have used it. But it never was passed by Parliament. So this little devil led to the dismissal and removal of hundreds of ministers who had Puritan sympathies or leanings. Because the first thing you wore was a surplice, in the front, you had the crows, you had all those things. And these ministers didn't have this, they didn't have the accoutrements, and within a week, they'd report you to the crown, and you would be questioned. Like, what are you doing? You're not following the Book of Common Prayer, you're not wearing the proper garments. And typically, they would try to blow it off. Well, it was a bad week. It was a bad week, I kind of forgot. Then it went on, and it wasn't a bad week. It became common practice. And so, literally, as James I said, we're going to harry them out of England. And Elizabeth put some pressure on them, but then James I put a lot of pressure on them. And then they had to. They went to the Netherlands. That's where the Pilgrims went to. And there they had a large degree of religious freedom. But the one thing I also found out in my research, not as much as I always thought, because what happened was England had really strong trading ties with the Netherlands, and they could put a lot of pressure on the Dutch to put pressure on these ministers to still conform. And they would harass them, not as much like in England, and you wouldn't be in prison, but they could harass you, they could get you voted out of your church. And a lot of ministers that came here were basically unemployed. They were unemployed, they hadn't worked in years. And also the other concern was they valued their English culture and tradition, and their children were becoming Dutch. And they weren't any longer Englishmen and Englishwomen. So the decision was made, first for the Pilgrims to come over, and they settled, Plymouth Plantation, and they had a separatist view. They didn't want to change the Church of England. They just wanted to go their own way. Again, the Bible being, this is the rule and law of the land. This is everything, right here. Everything you ever need to know is in the Scriptures. A few years later, people knew that the Pilgrims had done fairly well. It was hardship. But other Protestants said, we could go there also, and that would be a good place to go. So my family being from Dorchester, there's always this little dirty politicking going on. It was originally called the Dorchester Company, and ultimately it became the Massachusetts Bay Company. It's really funny how they get there. So it's a Dorchester Company, and it's really like down south. The company's formed to make money. We're going to send people over there, not by some religion. Whoever wants to go there can go there. They're going to farm, we're going to lend them money, and they're going to pay us back. And we're going to make profits on this. And they were at the point where they were looking at indentured servants, a couple prisoners here and there, people who were a little desperate. And then the Reverend White, who's a famous minister in Dorset, England, he was a very powerful Puritan minister in the 1610s, 1620s, again, a Cambridge graduate. And he must have been one hell of a politician because he figured out how to gerrymander and take over the Dorchester Company. And then it became the Dorchester Company of Adventurers. And they literally did in 2 meetings. They voted out the original stockholders, and there was about 10,000 pounds sterling in those days of value, voted them out, and these Puritans took over who probably had 500 pounds all told in it. But people weren't showing up to meetings, so they weren't representing their interests. And so ultimately they tried one colony in Cape Ann, it kind of failed. So then they sent more people when they became the Massachusetts Bay Company. And they all came on the Arabella and the other ship. And so there was a little collusion there in getting them here. And what did they want to do here? What did they want to accomplish? And what they wanted to accomplish is what John Winthrop called a city upon a hill for all the world to see. They were going to set an example of what it was to be really in abeyance of God. It was a new Jerusalem. It was a new Jerusalem. And of course, his speech and his sermon, even though he was an attorney, he gave the first sermon on the Arabelle, and then when they landed, which was basically the same one, that we're going to be set as an example. If we fail here, it's going to totally defame us in England, and we're going to be laughing stocks, or we can rise to the occasion. And the hardships were real. I mean, I think the first year, half the people died. I mean, there wasn't enough food. The only thing that saved them, and this happened really throughout New England, was that there were so many plagues and diseases from fishermen over the last 100 years beforehand that had wiped out probably 80% of the native tribes. So when they landed, I can tell you my family came to New Haven. When they landed in those areas, they saw these huge open fields. And people thought, oh, this is just like God. No, it's not. These were heavily populated areas. There's nobody left. Literally 80% of the tribes died in that period. It was just devastating. And that's why you look, the U.S. government struggled with Western tribes, but not really that much with Eastern, because the disease had just done such damage to them. Anyway, without getting ahead of myself, so they came here, and right away, people can't agree on everything. Right? You know how it is. We don't have that in our church, right? We don't agree on everything. We agree on everything. And again, I'm going to bring in my family beliefs. I know I'm related to somebody, Ann Hutchinson, but she was one big troublemaker. I'm just going to say that.
Okay. That's where she got killed.
Yeah.
Ann Hutchinson? Yeah. That's the parkway. They have
Yes.
Yes.
on the, she comes from the Western Bridge and goes straight to Ann
There's a
Hutchinson.
little marker where she got,
Yes.
She had a little problem with Native Americans. We
Oh.
got a little bad relations there.
Yeah.
You don't kidnap the chief's kids. Okay, but so we're going to get to Ann Hutchinson. She was one of those bad things that we didn't like. All right, she was an antinomian. That means no law.
no,
No law. That meant,
that's my kind of woman.
that meant, this was it. And any other law didn't matter. And in some ways you can simplify things, right? It's a theocracy. Kind of makes sense in some ways. Most of the law was from here. But that meant you wouldn't conform to the crowd, because that were outside of that. But then she went a little further. Remember, her father was an incredibly powerful and loved minister back in Middlesex, England. So she came from, remind you, ministers in those days were the upper class. They were the upper class. They were educated, they had substantial properties, and they carried weight of respect like nobody, Again, I think in England at that time, less than 1% of people had university degrees. Every minister did in the Protestant Presbyterian Congregationalist church. Not only that, so they were only really learned people. They were the most learned people by far. So they had a lot of authority based on that. So anyway, so Anne starts with that. Then Anne starts a Bible study group, which was great. And it became very popular. As a matter of fact, it became too popular. There were way more people going to Anne's house. First women, and then men were coming there. And it started to really be felt in the church that the ministers didn't have the draw and didn't have the following that Anne had. And there's certainly a feministic thing there about her being prejudiced against, and I get it, that's a truism, that's absolutely true. There's also a hierarchy thing. Who the hell is Anne Hutchinson? Oh yeah, her dad's a great minister, her family's very prominent, she's well married, she's the upper class. But then she starts to defame the ministers. And she said that they bring a false ministry, a ministry of works, not a ministry of grace. So they first have her come before a hearing. And I want to get this because Anne Hutchinson and the antinomians are the big movement in the church, and led to a lot of splits. So they call her before a hearing, the ministers hear her, and they question. And she has a lot of supporters. As a matter of fact, the great light of early New England was John Cotton, the great minister. And John Cotton sided with her. And so when she went before the hearing, John Cotton also testified on her behalf. And it went on, and basically, at the end of the day, they forgot they were also dealing with some really smart theologians on the other side of the table. And they got John Cotton into a corner, theologically, and he had to abandon him, because it was going to either be she's going to go, or both going to go, and vanished. And again, they were waiting for John Cotton to come to Boston for like 2 years. I mean, it was like the Pope coming this year to America. They were waiting for Cotton as a great light even in England. So what they did was they condemned her in January. But what they did was, and they, again, all their bad people, they waited until late March. She had until late March to settle her affairs and springtime to leave. They weren't going to have her go in the middle of winter. Now mind you, before she went, they warned her like 20 times. So So she went down to what became Providence. Even there, she had it out with Williams. Who?
Roger Williams.
Roger Williams. He was easygoing. He couldn't even stand her and sent her on her way down towards the Bronx. And you know that's punishment.
Even today.
Even today. So what happened? Okay, the ministers realized they had a problem because forget about that Anne was gone, but now she had a big impact. And they had to accept some of the things that she said. They kind of captured it in the services. But the other thing was they had the Cambridge platform, the first agreement of churches in the United States. And basically what it did was it said, we don't allow antinomianism. No, out. It's heresy. Can't do it. And that was, I think, 1636. So they're only in Boston a few years and already have major problems, have to have this platform. All right. So they're gone. Ministers keep coming over from England. And again, even with those people that were strict Trinitarians, strict Old Book, they started breaking apart. And there were more conservative people amongst them. So Cotton kind of fades back, still there in Boston. Hutchinson is now down in Rhode Island. And we have some great ministers. We have Richard Mather, yeah, Cotton increases grandfather and father. We have my family, Thomas Hooker. Yeah, I know. He was there. Thomas Hooker, great minister who founded Hartford. And we had John Davenport, also part of my family, who founded New Haven. And they were more conservative than the Boston people. And this goes, it's interesting, this conservatism goes on for the next 250 years. So they break away, and literally, that's interesting about Hooker, he actually walked the people in 1642 from Boston. They actually walked, didn't take a ship, through the wilderness in early spring and settled Hartford. And then that became the Connecticut colony. Below that was the New Haven colony. New Haven colony was even more conservative than the Hartford colony, than the Connecticut colony. And that was John Davenport, another great light, another Cambridge graduate. So time goes on, and they weren't together. They had problems with Indian tribes, but there was a very distinct difference that was going on. And I'm probably going to jump here a little bit, but I'm going to take you where this all goes. So we have Harvard, which were all the ministers that were here, and they named the town, not Oxford, Cambridge. It was only Mississippi that named it Oxford, believe it there. You didn't go there. So they founded the college, and within, just like in society, there was liberals and conservatives in the group. And again, this is part of why Hooker left and why Davenport left. They went out, and all of a sudden, within 10, 15 years, Davenport wants to build a college in New Haven. And he didn't have enough money. What happened was, there was actually, one incident can destroy a town. New Haven would have been as great as Boston, except one thing happened. In 1638, it was called the Great Ship. They had loaded up all the production of 1 year of New Haven in one of the largest British ships ever constructed. It went down. It went down and basically it devastated New Haven. It never recovered. Even into the 1700s, never recovered from those losses. And nobody wanted them to trade with New Haven, saying it's a dangerous harbor, it's not reliable, use Boston, use New York. Don't go to New Haven. It's just bad vibes there, bad things happening. So Davenport never had the resources because of that to build. He built a private school, which was basically like equivalent of like first grade through 8th grade. And again, all the upper class or kids of ministers would go to Harvard. Harvard started taking in Arminianism. Now, Jacobus Arminius was a Dutchman, and he believed in things we would believe today. People are basically good. They're not born necessarily out of sin. People have a natural gravitation to do good things. Versus, people are born in sin. People are just wallowing, almost like John Bunyan's Pilgrim. They're wallowing in despair, just horrible, just one step from being total savages. So the Arminianism comes in, and that was closely attached to the Church of England. And they said, oh, this is kind of close to the Church of England, we don't want that. So they're starting now to kick up, they want to have their own college. So my 8th great-grandfather said, "You got a good idea." And he helped form Yale University. He was the first president of Yale University. He was our minister. My family's from Newark, New Jersey, which was the last Puritan community founded in America in 1666. They were the most conservative, even more so than New Haven. And his father was a Cambridge graduate, but he himself was a Harvard graduate, who founded as first rector of Yale University. And the answer there, it's interesting. Increase Mather, Samuel Sewall, who was the great judge who was on the witch trial jury, he's the only one who ever apologized. They're still up in Boston, January 5th, they're called Forgiveness Sunday, and that's where the people read his confession before the congregation of the evil he did in convicting the witches. Nobody else had the guts to do that. But Sewall, Mather, and I can't remember the other minister, well, Davenport himself, but one of the ministers up there, they worked really hard to found Yale. And with Boston money, some money from the Connecticut colony, a little bit from the Crown, and also a donation from Elihu Yale, who was a local family actually, but had some shipping interest and money, which endowed the library. They started this more conservative school. So the answer is 1701, right? We have Yale University. And really small at first, that's going to be, and it was more conservative by far. So now we have a supply of ministers, and where are we supplying them to? Well, Boston is too liberal, they're not going there. So they're going up the Connecticut Valley, they're going through Connecticut, and they're going out to New Jersey, little parts of it are still part of Puritan New England. So we have that thing in education perspective. The next step that happened, I'm going to jump a little bit in here, is that people felt Yale was getting too conservative. So in 1742, they founded a college called Princeton. And that became the final resting place of the most conservative academic program within the Protestant Puritan Church. It's interesting because I'm going to go back a little bit now to a movement that came. So we have this first and second generation. We have Boston, we have New Haven, we have Hartford, we have the Connecticut Valley now being developed. And in the Connecticut Valley, we had a great thing happen. First, a man named George Whitefield came, who was an English, basically a Methodist, and he was a great preacher. And he really started the Great Awakening. He came through all the towns in New England and basically professed, a personal acceptance of God, a personal experience, a revelation and a conversion that you yourself witnessed. This was always, that conversion was always a big problem. And I'm going to touch on something else right now that also split the church, the halfway covenant. And that was a big schism also. About the same time we had Yale forming and conservatives and liberals kind of partying. And what that said was that if you were not a member of the church, you could not have your children baptized. End of story. And here's the problem. Even though most people, like 99%, were Puritan, only about 35% were members. Because it was a pain to become a member. It cost a lot of money. You had to have a personal confession of faith. You had people test you. It was a big, long process. So as time went on, for the first generation, probably half met the requirement. By the second generation, the 1640s, very few people. And ministers said, if we want to have a church that's still growing, we have to open up membership. We have to allow people who were already baptized, even though they're not members, to then baptize their children. And if they haven't been baptized, then baptize the parents, then the children. Well, that split the church, even the conservative piece in half. And so what happened was they fought about it for 60 years, and they came up with a halfway covenant. And a lot of churches didn't accept it. Here's what it said. You could baptize your children if you were baptized. You didn't have to be a member. And then your children could then become members after you became a member. But it put you really as an integral part of the community. Now remember, in these times, and I know my own family did, in Newark, I'll tell you, it's a typical Puritan town. Here's what happened on Sunday morning at 7. Boom! 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 Drum. Church. Don't go show up at church. Fines 20 shillings. Do it twice, and lock you up. So you went to church. That wasn't a choice. And so what was the service like? I wanted to capture this because we say it's cold in here sometimes, but there was no heat in the church because that was the devil. Comfort is the devil. The hardest American chestnut or oak. Forget about pine, it's too soft. On your bare arse to keep you awake. And the sermon went 3 hours in the morning and another 3 to 4 hours in the afternoon. And I'm talking a sermon.
Don't tell them.
I won't. And that wasn't bad enough. If you nodded off, there was a fellow who came around with a stick and he'd either poke you, if you really, he'd whack you, okay?
Man, I'll be dead.
Now, there was a pastime, they happened in my own town. I'll tell you how Presbyterian I am. My family's been Presbyterian forever. I grew up in a town of Caldwell, New Jersey, named after the Reverend James Caldwell, the fighting parson, Presbyterian. I went to James Caldwell High School. My family's property was bought by the Presbyterian Church when they sold the parcel of land, and my family were Presbyterian, so I am the Presbyterian right man. Not proud of it, but I'm not ashamed of it either.
Just say savant, honey. Just
What?
say savant.
Savant. I like what Ron said. I always think about Qantas. So, where was I going with this? Caldwell. So, in the church, oh yeah. So in between men being men, and women are always much better behaved than men. That's still true. I admit it. The men would go out and they'd have bear baiting. And then you throw the dog in the pit with a bear, gamble. Who comes out? And James Caldwell came there because he was the traveling minister. He came there every third Sunday. And there were literally all hell broke loose. And he caught him because they had to cut the game soon enough when he came on horseback. And it was like the end of the drinking the hard cider and getting loaded before service. And they were doing the bear baiting and gambling. And the women were doing decent things. They were, crocheting, doing things stuff with them. And these guys are just out there raising all kinds of hell like a fraternity, So they brought that to an end. And that's part of also why the whole belief of prohibitionism came into our church later on, because it was seen as being just such an undermining power. So that gives you a feeling for the church. In the long services, people didn't want to go back. It was torture. It was just cold and torturous. So I'm going to bring us now forward in time. So we've got Yale, we've got Harvard, we've got Princeton. There's still some fighting going on. They need a college. They need a college of really good Calvinists in Western Massachusetts. They call it Amherst. Founded for the same reason by the Dickinson family. Emily's grandfather, Samuel Fowler, founded the college. And so anyway, there's all this schisms going on, and they're trying to resolve it in their own ways. And then we end up, even within the church in Boston at Harvard, there was an appointment in 1808 of Henry Ware Sr. And Henry Ware was a Unitarian, first one. And he took the Hollis Chair in Divinity, which was the highest chair in divinity in the whole country. It was also only theological school at the time. Everybody else would go to Princeton or go to Dartmouth, and they would get a general study, then have a practicum with a minister. So that really stood it up because it went from being a kind of Congregationalist to now Unitarian. And from that group, we had born the Unitarian Universalist Church. And basically, what did they say? They said a lot of things. They said that this was a really nice book. It's a really nice book. They said, Jesus is a guy. He's a prophet. He's unique. He's special. But he's not the Son of God. The whole anti-Trinitarianism came at that point, which is why they had Unitarian. They basically said, yeah, there's God, there's a Holy Spirit, and Jesus was inspired by God, but there's nothing special about Jesus. He's a man. He's a God. Of course, that struck at the roots of the whole Trinitarian belief, from Roman Catholicism out even basically almost to the Quakers. Everybody believed in the Trinity. And so what they did was there became a battle in the 1820s and 1830s, 1840s. On one side, we have Ralph Waldo Emerson, we all know Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, brilliant guy, by the way, brilliant guys. We have William Ellery Channing, the minister of the great Unitarian Church of Boston, brilliant guy. His nephew was a great poet in the Transcendentalist time as well, by the same name. So these great thinkers, and it's interesting because I think where the law really got laid down at Harvard, and it was even too extreme for them, is Emerson's Divinity School address, in which that he ripped apart the whole education program at Harvard, at the Divinity School. Way too conservative, not liberal enough. And there was actually later on, I'm just trying to see my notes here, there was actually a response to that. But there actually was a response later on to a retort to what Emerson said, because it was scathing. I'll tell you how scathing it was. Emerson was a big public figure in the Boston area. He wasn't invited back to Harvard for 30 years. That's how people, the schism was between them. So at this point now you have Unitarians, and now they're splitting. Transcendentalists are the most liberal. And then you have basically the conservative Unitarians, who look a little bit like a Congregationalist. They certainly have the government of Congregationalism, which they still have to this day. And what I'm trying to take you down is this whole splintering that's taking on, right? So we have Presbyterians, and remember, one thing I almost forgot. Presbyterians were of Cromwell in the British Civil War. The Roundheads were Presbyterians, and they wrote the Westminster Confession of Faith. They're all Presbyterians. They worked closely with the non-separatist Congregationalists, but in the end, they outvoted them. And that's, I think the Westminster Confession of Faith only passed by like 80 votes in Parliament when it got confirmed, because while the Congregationalists kind of supported it, they didn't want anything coming from above. They wanted to have the congregations decide what was going to be right and wrong. So we're splintering, and I think part of it, we're going to be on 500 years now since Martin Luther. I don't think anybody in the Protestant Church ever thought it would take 500 years to get back with the Catholic Church. I think they felt they could do it in 50 years or less. And I think the splintering that's going on is because the intention was never to go this far. You know, and time just creates differences. It just does. So I always love the Unitarians. I love the Transcendentalists. Brilliant people. I love reading them. But I think this is funny because this is one of my favorite books. I'm just going to find my page. Give me 1 second. I think this is great because it quotes. Oh yeah, it quotes how the Transcendentalists were felt about. Because today they're given a lot of favor. But here's what Charles Dickens said. What he describes them as, whatever was unintelligible would certainly be transcendental in their mind. Thomas Carlyle spoke of George Ripley, and George Ripley founded the famous Brook Farm community, which was basically all these transcendentalist intellectuals, men and women, that went to Brook Farm, which is a great museum outside of Boston, you should go there sometime. And so the great Thomas Carlyle said, and he spoke of George Ripley, who was a great minister. He's a Socian minister who has left the pulpit to reform the world by cultivating onions. The same farm, one of the kids that was born there and raised there, her married name was Amy Russell Marble. And here's what she said about the Transcendentals. A race who dove into the infinite, soared into the illimitable, and never paid cash. Historian Henry Adams had it best. He said they were unutterably funny. Had a great impact on the country, no doubt. Great writing. As a matter of fact, I gave Sarah a book, which was Henry David Thoreau's journals, which are phenomenal. They get a chance, just so spiritual. And they were spiritually rich. And I used to always condemn Emerson, because he left the ministry. But you know, he did something great. He knew he couldn't abide by even the most liberal of dogma. He had to be on his own. And I give the guy great credit because he was true to himself. And he did it, and he was married and had kids. He didn't have the freedom of like a Henry David Thoreau who never had kids. He was very courageous. So my joking is within the family of Unitarians, because they're great people and they have a great intellectual tradition that we benefited from, no doubt about it. So at that time, Transcendentalism and Unitarians became very powerful. It was very user-friendly, more so than Calvinism was. And so there was actually a line drawn up the Connecticut River Valley, and that's where the defense went. And my five great uncles went there to reinforce this. They reached down to the most conservative school they could grab, Princeton. They're both Princeton men. And the brothers, Jonathan Bailey and Joseph, can't his name again, Condit, went up. First, Jonathan Bailey was the minister at Longmeadow, Massachusetts. He then became the first professor of rhetoric and theology at Amherst, close friend of the Dixon family. And there, because Amherst was a bulwark against the Unitarian movement, because it was gaining strength. His younger brother Joseph became the minister at South Hadley Congregational Church, and he housed a woman in his manse with his wife for 2 years, and her name was Mary Lyon, and he helped build a whole new college. It was now the Merrill Alumni House as his manse. So these guys were really, really strict. Now, to show you how ministers fall in and out of favor, and again, it's a flavor of what's happening here in the country, right? You love your minister, you hate your minister, right? Love them, put them on the next wagon out of town. Joseph was a minister in East Hampton, Long Island. And that was unique in a way because it had a huge amount of local Native Americans that were still there. Half the congregation was that. But he did believe in one, and then when they dismissed him, I read the history book, and I swear this is what they described him as. He was a very weak man and a poor example of the minister. That's the official records of the church. He was an abolitionist, and he was a prohibitionist. And they were shipping people, and they wanted liquor, and they wanted slaves. So they were happy to do it. When he went up to Southampton, they loved him. He was there for 28 years, and they loved him. And there's a great book about his paintings of him are in the art museum in Holyoke. But there they loved him, and basically because they were into prohibitions, they were into abolitions. And it shows you again that you can be hated, really hated in one place, or you can be loved. Case in point, another person, Jonathan Edwards, one of my ancestors, Northampton, Massachusetts. They loved him in Northampton, the Great Awakening born out of him. And yet, when he got to the halfway covenant, he didn't support it. His own grandfather supported it, the Solomon Stoddard, the great Solomon Stoddard. But he didn't, and the people knew the church couldn't grow, and they voted him out after 20 years. And really in a mean way. So where he went next was to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, where he founded worked with Stockbridge Indians. And then became, later on, when he left that job, became president of Princeton University. He was only there 3 months before he died of, I think, smallpox. But you have all these mechanisms going on. So you have halfway covenant, you have personal interpretation of the Bible. And where it's really come down, and I think it's on what Wayne said last week, it's always about government power. Right? At the end, you can, Scripture is a great weapon, right? More people have been killed in the name of God than anything. But it comes to power and politics. And a perfect example is the families who were on the Connecticut Valley. And they're all related to all of them, and they hated each other, okay? So Jonathan Edwards read Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Anybody ever hear of that? You're going to hell, yeah. It was like hellfire brimstone, the ultimate American sermon. You know who was directed at? The first 2 rows of the Northampton Church. You know who they were? His cousins. His in-laws. The Williamses, Williams College, yeah, that was a family. They were river gods. The Dwights, the Edwardses, the Williams, they were all intermarried. Everybody, wasn't that many people. And that's why also they got rid of him, because Williams had it with him. And it's interesting because Stephen Williams, who was his uncle, was very close to him. But the other Williamses were very successful merchants in the Connecticut River Valley. And they did not like being held to task about ignoring the poor, helping others than themselves. They also, it's interesting, in Stockbridge, there's called the Mission House, which is where, it's a great museum if you ever get a chance. That's where he lived to help proselytize I guess it was part of the Lenape tribe. And when he went there, it was like the most undesirable job you could ever want to have. But he stayed there. It's interesting because he came because the prime minister had died. And his name was Jonathan Sargent. He was from North New Jersey, Princeton graduate. But the wife, the widow, was a Williams, Phoebe Williams. Yeah. And here's the other part. It's just so interesting how these things mesh together. So we have Edwards gets dismissed, right? Edward's sister, Elizabeth, marries into the Dwight family. Her son, to get even with all these people, becomes the great Timothy Dwight. They call him the Pope of Connecticut. 2nd president of Yale, and his son, 3rd president of Yale. So the Dwights got even. But all those years after he was removed, he went down to Stockbridge. Elizabeth would come every Sunday, and she would sit outside the church, right in the north annex. She did it for 27 years. She wanted to remind them of what they had done to her father. And it's no joke that her son and grandson took that position. Now, Jonathan Edwards had another grandson who actually was a kid in our family's manse in North New Jersey. His grandson, you'll probably know by the name of Aaron Burr, John Edwards' grandson. And people they loved Aaron Burr. He basically ran Princeton College when it was in Newark, and then moved it with a land grant down to Princeton. So now we're going to come up to modern times. So I've kind of like dwelled on this, I think, to the end, what's happened. So what happens now in the 20th century? What do we do with our church? So we
achieve perfection.
We achieve perfection. I'm trying. So the Presbyterian Church stood on the Civil War. The Northern Church, anti-slavery, Southern pro-slavery. And, you know, I had a real shocker, and I'm going to share this with you. I went to a Presbyterian church in Savannah, Georgia. This is a church that Woodrow Wilson's wife's father was minister of, and he got married at that church. Now, mind you, it doesn't say First Presbyterian Church, United Presbyterian Church. By the way, it's not part of PCUSA. 1,000 people there, and there's one African American. It just shocked me. It just shocked me. And it was like driving Miss Daisy. Every woman was dressed to the nines. I mean, it was a show. It was a show. It was just incredible. So we stood on the Civil War and didn't come back together until, I think, 1981. That's how long it took to get over that whole Civil War thing. So our church, you know, went through the Civil War, separated. A lot of Presbyterians, a lot of Congregationalists were abolitionists. You can go down the line of them all. I think the most famous one, who I really honor, John Brown, who was a hero. Atop of him was a great Presbyterian minister, Elijah Lovejoy, a son of Maine. And it's interesting because one day I was talking to Molly before she left, and she said, "Who's your hero in the Presbyterians?" And I said, "Elijah Lovejoy." She said, "Brad, he was from my church outside of St. Louis, that's where he was. He had a printing press, and he printed abolition papers continuously. They burned his printing press building down 4 times, his church once, and finally they murdered him right on the banks of the Mississippi. But he died for his belief. And that shows you where the Presbyterians went. They were willing to die to free slaves. And they were very active in the Underground Railroad, getting African Americans to Canada. So, you know, we should be proud of a lot of what we did, because we did it wasn't popular. We were kind of on the fringe. So we come into the 20th century, and, you know, Arminianism is in. You know, we are basically born, if not neutral, basically good. People are basically good. You interpret the Bible for yourself. But we had one big bogeyman. I'm going to finish with this bogeyman. Oh, it's almost time. The bogeyman was trying to resolve the differences between creationism and evolution. And basically, the scientific method and the Enlightenment really destroyed a lot of the underpinnings of the Bible and church. And why? Well, now we had other learned men that weren't ministers. They're scientists, they're philosophers, and they were tied down to dogma. So you weren't the smartest guy in town anymore, you were one of a lot. Second of all, people said, well, you know, Charles Darwin and the Beagle looked at these finches and saw their beaks, how they adapted to the food on each of these islands in the Galapagos, and you could see how they evolved. I mean, just a few miles, different food, they evolved differently, but they had a common ancestor. And it was really, really difficult to reconcile how we got there. And the truth is, the church didn't survive it well. And the reason the church didn't survive it well is the church tried to argue on scientific grounds, and you can't win that one because it's not science. Right? The Bible's true science. It's not going to withstand that kind of testing. It's spiritual, right? It's something that's beyond the physical world. So it brings us up to my final piece. Yes, that final piece, the monkey trials, scope trials. And yes, there were Presbyterians there. William Jennings Bryan, great Presbyterian and great attorney. And what they did in Tennessee was, and this is all staged, I never realized that it would totally stage the whole trial. Tennessee had a law that you only teach creationism, not evolution. So there was a substitute teacher in science who was asked by the American Civil Liberties Union to profess that he taught evolution one day as a son. He didn't really, but it was a test trial. So he said, okay, I did it, charge me. They charge him. And so they get Clarence Darrow to be his attorney. They said, we need somebody who's going to, and again, it's all set up. We want to also see somebody from the fundamentalist side. So William James Bryan, this great attorney, great statesman, is also a really, really strict hardcore Presbyterian. And so they had the trial. And in the end, they proved nothing. I think they found the teacher guilty. It was a suspended sentence, nothing happened, but you know, it didn't clear the air either way. The people who believed in evolution still believed in evolution, and the people who believed in creationism had that as well. And William Jennings Bryan, just to give you background, big-time Democrat, very successful senator and congressman, and he believed in, you know, the free coinage of silver, really was a man of the middle class and supported the middle class people a lot. So, you know, brings us today, we've had, certainly since that time, in the 50s and 60s, we had people like William Slow Coffin, who was a great minister, grew up here, not far away, actually on Byron Lake Road, with a family estate. He was a great anti-war proponent, really fought hard to stop the Vietnam War. So we've had a lot of peace activists, a lot of us in the civil rights movement in the 60s and the 70s, and so we've been a progressive people. I think we've come a long way. You know, we've left hanging people and banishing them to where, you know, we are more tolerant, we're better. We're not perfect, we're not even close to perfect. We're trying though. But, you know, that's how we got where we are. So we were Puritans, but we came out as Presbyterians because we wanted to rule by elders. We wanted to have the guidance of a slight hierarchy, but an elected wanted that. Just on our side, Connecticut Congregationalism didn't really exist. It was Presbyterian form until about 1850. They established that because they saw the weaknesses in Massachusetts, and they had synods. Also, the other thing in Connecticut, until 1828, your state tax dollars supported the Congregational Church. So much for separation of church and state. But I hope I gave you some idea of what happened, how we ended up where we were, and who knows where we're going, you know. But thank you all for coming. I really enjoyed it.
So great, huh?